Hello everybody, this is a review of Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is an introduction to human anatomy and physiology, and first thing we want to understand, what does anatomy mean and what does physiology mean? So anatomy is actually the study of the structure of parts of the human body, which and anatomy is actually derived from the Greek word of cutting up. So in anatomy, you're just studying what does an organ look like? Is it round? Is it square? How many chambers does it have? For example, the heart has 4, and so on. So it really doesn't tell you anything about the function of the organ. It just tells you about kind of like mapping or telling you what the organ looks like and where is it in the body. So you'll learn that the heart, for example, is in the thoracic cavity. But again, that didn't tell you anything about how the heart works. That is physiology. So studying the function or how body parts work, that is the physiology part. And they are very related to each other. So you will find that the structure of a function really helps it perform its function. Okay, so there, like I said, the structure of organs and the different parts of the human body really determine their function. And we want to learn, before we actually talk about the different organs and the organ system, we want to learn about the different levels of organization, which means that we are going to start, from the very smallest particles, which are the subatomic particles, meaning if they break down the atom into its components, you have the protons, neutrons, and electrons, and then you kind of build yourself up all the way to an actual organism, which is the human being. So I'd rather actually use the picture to kind of go over these together. So you have, before the atom, you have the subatomic particles, which are, again, your electrons, protons, and neutrons. And then you can make an atom. Okay, if you put a couple of atoms together, you can make a molecule. So for example, you would have a hydrogen atom and oxygen atoms, and then you could put those together and you can make H2O, which is a water molecule. If you put lots of molecules together, you can make a macromolecule. So you will find that, for instance, proteins are macromolecules, where you brought in different amino acids and you put them together and to make this bigger molecule known as a macromolecule. Now these macromolecules, you gather a whole bunch of them together, those will give you an organelle. Now notice that I am saying an organelle and not an organ, because these organelles are microscopic structures, and those make the different the parts of the cell. For example, the mitochondria, the Golgi apparatus, the nucleus, and the different parts, the microscopic structures of the cell. When you put all of these organelles and you put a cell wall or a membrane around them, that will give you a cell. Now this cell, different cells have different structures. So you will find that we have, for example, nervous cells, blood cells, muscle cells, and so on. These different cells have different structures, and hence they also have different functions. But if you put different kinds of cells and you bind them together, you can get tissue. Okay. Now a tissue is something that would have a specific function. So for instance, you will find that, for instance, gastric tissue, which is tissue of the stomach, would have, for example, a secretory function. So it would have glands in there. Okay, so again, if you bring a lot of cells together that would have the same function, that will give you a tissue. Again, we have different kinds of tissue. So you'll have nervous tissue, muscular tissue, glandular tissue, and so on. If you put all of those, gather them, kind of bundle them up, you can get an organ. Now, an organ has a specific function, but in order to perform its function, it has to have different kinds of tissue. So the stomach, for example, which is what you're seeing here, has muscles, okay? It has nerves to control those muscles. It also has glands in there. So again, you see different kinds of tissue that work together to perform a specific function. And in that case, you'll get an organ. If you bunch up a group of organs together that have this bigger function. For example, in here, they're giving us the example of the digestive system. So we basically have the salivary glands, the stomach, the liver, the gallbladder, intestines, and so on. All of those have the same function of eating, chewing, digestion, and absorption, and they all together make your digestive system. And we will call that an organ system. Now, in order to have an organism, which in this case is a human, you have to have, digestive system, respiratory system, reproductive system, and all these other systems put together in order to make an organism. So you want to know these levels of organization, and you want to be able to go in either direction. So you can either start with your subatomic particles and build up to this organism, or you want to also be able to break down this bigger organism into its smaller components. And that's really what we're going to be doing in throughout the course. We are going to start talking first off about an atom, and organelles, cells, and the different kind of tissue, but then we are going to break down the human, the organism in this case, into digestive system, respiratory, reproductive, urinary, and so on. So a little clinical application, and what are the different, a couple of non-invasive procedures that we could image at the inside or the internal structures. Okay, when we say non-invasive procedures, we mean things that we, kind of like apply different things from the outside of the body without having to poke the patient. So for instance, you've got ultrasounds. These are high frequency sound waves, and those can give you different images that show the internal structures. Usually it helps with the soft structure. So ultrasound is not really a good tool to use if you want to take a look at bones, for instance. An MRI, okay, that is a magnetic field, and it really depends on, or kind of counts on, the spinning of the atoms, and it gives you a very high resolution image of the internal structures. And it is also really good with soft tissue. It gives you a better picture than ultrasound does. Now, what are the characteristics of life? And when we say characteristics of life, we mean, like, how do you know that an organism is actually a living thing or not? So characteristics of life distinguishes us as living beings from a chair, for example, that is a non-living thing. So these are the different things that we are able to do in order to be categorized as living beings. So movement, okay, so we can change our positions, okay. Know that these are things that we do not necessarily have to have, okay, but they things that would characterize us as living things. Responsiveness, okay, so we are able to we pick up different stimuli from the outside world, and we can respond to them. These stimuli do not have to really be something from the outside. They could be changes on the inside of the body. For example, changes in oxygen levels, changes maybe in sodium levels, and so on, but we are able to respond to these changes. Okay. Growth would be the increase in body size without change in shape. So there's this baby that is born, and there's the head, legs, and arms. The baby will grow, but it would still have that same shape. Okay, the shape, we don't change our shape as we grow. We just change in size. Now, reproduction. Okay, so the ability to produce new organisms, also the ability to produce new cells. So we have the ability to regenerate our own cells. We will find out that that's not the case with all of our cells, but with the majority of cells, that is true. Respiration, which is basically breathing, the ability to intake oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide and do that gas exchange at the level of either the lungs or at the cellular level. And we're definitely going to be going into the details of all of these little things. So this is more kind of like a summary, I guess, of these different processes. I do recommend, though, putting these into flashcards, because these are really important definitions that you want to be familiar with. Digestion would be the breakdown of the food that we intake. So as we eat, we cannot really absorb that slice of pizza as it is, okay? We have to break it down into smaller chemicals and smaller molecules in order to absorb that. And absorption, that is the process of the passage of these smaller molecules through the membranes of different tissue. So we will find that, for example, glucose will pass from the small intestine into the bloodstream. So that is an example of absorption. Now, circulation. We have to have the ability to circulate or move different substances through our body fluids. And that is usually, obviously the function mainly of the cardiovascular system, so the heart and blood. Okay. Assimilation. That is the changing of the absorbed substances into different chemicals. So yes, we do absorb glucose, okay, which is a kind of sugar. We also absorb amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, but then we take them and use them to make bigger things, okay? So that process is known as assimilation. So we can take those building blocks, those amino acids, put them together to make a muscle protein, for example, okay? That is known as assimilation. And we will find that one of the most important organs that does that process is the liver. Excretion is the removal of waste products, and that one of the most important organs that performs that function are the kidneys. Okay, so metabolism is another definition that you really want to be familiar with, and that is, all of the chemical reactions that happen in the body, it falls under that definition. Okay, so as we break down different components or we build up different molecules, all of these different chemical reactions are gathered together in that term of metabolism. Now, how do we maintain life? Okay, in order to maintain life, there are 5 things that we have to have, okay? And these are mainly environmental factors, so we kind of depend on the environment to provide us with these factors. And those are, number 1, the most important is water. Okay, you know that water is the most abundant substance in your body. Okay, water is where all of the metabolic processes are going to happen. So all of the chemical reactions are going to need water in order for these reactions to occur. Okay, we need water to transport substances. So when we talk about the composition of blood, you will find that blood is mainly made out of water as well. And it's in that water, different things are circulating. And water is also important for regulation of body temperature. Okay, so and that is why, sweating, that loss of water by evaporation and so on, helps us to maintain our constant body temperatures. Now, food, that's how we get our necessary nutrients. Okay, it supplies us with energy, and it also gives us the raw material to build up our different tissues. So we will learn that muscle is made out of different proteins, and in order for us to build that protein, we need to intake protein, okay? We also have glucose, for instance, okay? We're going to need that glucose, and we have to intake it in the form of food. Oxygen, okay, is obviously another important requirement that our body needs. We also need oxygen in order to release energy from nutrients. So we will see that some of the chemical reactions that happen in the body in order to make energy, we actually need oxygen in order to perform these reactions. Heat is another requirement that we need. And heat, really, we can find heat in the form of energy, okay? And the way we produce heat is really that by us eating food, burning that food, and releasing some of that energy as heat. Our heart is the number 1 heat producer in the body, and it will circulate that heat that it produces through the bloodstream to the rest of the body. Okay, so all of that pumping that happens all day long is going to produce a lot of heat, and that helps in maintaining body temperature. Okay, that heat also helps control some of the metabolic reactions. So a lot of our enzymes need a certain temperature in order to work, and high body temperatures, so fevers, for example, or hypothermia, which is a low body temperature, can affect how some of these enzymes will function. Now, pressure, for example, the atmospheric pressure. Okay, that is important for breathing. So when we talk about the respiratory system, we will find that it's very hard. It gets harder to breathe if you are on top of a mountain or if somebody goes diving. Okay, so that any change in the atmospheric pressure can affect breathing. And there's another pressure that is really important, and that is known as the hydrostatic pressure. Hydro means water, and so hydrostatic pressure is basically when water flows, it'll exert a pressure on the blood vessels, and that is known as the hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic pressure keeps the blood flowing through the blood vessels. Now, the process of homeostasis. So let's break down the word. Homeo means the environment. Okay, stasis means to keep it the same. So homeostasis is really all about maintaining a stable internal environment. So what does that mean, kind of like in plain English? It means that your body has to have a stable, a certain range of body temperature, a certain level of oxygen, carbon dioxide levels, sodium levels, chloride levels. If you can think of something that's in your body, it has to lie within a range, and that in order to keep these levels stable, that whole process is known as homeostasis. And there are different mechanisms that the body uses in order to keep these things within constant levels. Okay, so these homeostatic mechanisms, these are self-regulating systems that monitor the different changes in the internal environment and correct them as needed, which means that you don't really have to think about adjusting your blood pressure, or you don't have to think about adjusting your body temperature. Your body has these different monitors on your inside of the body that'll pick up any change. So as if you start exercising, you are producing more heat within your body because of all of the muscle contractions. Now your body picks that up and you start sweating. Okay, so that is a whole, that is an example of homeostatic mechanism. Again, so it's a self-regulating system. Again, it's not something that you can control. These are automatic or autonomic systems that monitor your internal environment. So if anything changes within your environment on the inside of the body, your body has a way to correct them. Okay, within limits, obviously. Okay, so there are three different parts of that mechanism. There is a receptor, and these receptors are trying to pick up the change. They will detect if there is a change in the environment. Okay, so they're called receptors because they kind of receive that kind of information. So they detect and provide the information from the stimulus. So let's take an example of, being, I think the example that they're using here, okay. So we'll take the example of, so that homeostatic mechanisms do not only have to be changes in the internal environment, they can also be changes to the external environment. So I'll give you an example of an external environment. Let's say somebody is going to get pricked by a needle. Okay, so there are pain receptors in the skin that are going to detect or feel that pain and take that stimulus. The stimulus means that pain that the person felt, and take it to the control center. The control center is usually a part in the central nervous system. It can either be in the brain or in the spinal cord. Okay, and it will kind of compare it to a set point. Like, should I be in pain or is this unusual? And that control center will decide, well, no, that's unusual, and will send another impulse to a muscle, to the effector, and the effector is either a muscle or a gland that is going to respond to what the control center tells it to do. So in the example we were talking about, somebody gets pricked by a needle. It's a painful stimulus, so you withdraw your hand. Okay, so that is the effector. The effect is that that skeletal muscle withdrew your hand away from the source of pain. Again, remember that an effector will produce the effect, and it could be either a muscle or a gland. Okay, and that will produce the necessary change to the environment that happened. And again, homeostasis can either be internal or external environment. So here again is kind of like an image showing you how the homeostatic mechanism works. So there is a stimulus, which is a change in the environment, that will be picked up by the receptors. Now, when that receptor picks up the change, it'll send an impulse to the control center, and that control center compares it to your set point. And then it will send a signal to the effectors, which again are either muscles or glands, to produce a response in order to correct that change. So we had kind of already talked about an example of the external stimulus. Now I want to talk about an example of a change of an internal stimulus. So we'll take the example of a high change in body temperature. So know that the set point for body temperature is in a part of the brain known as the hypothalamus. That is the control center. And that you want to kind of consider that as your thermostat, so to speak. Okay. We'll say that a person is going to start exercising, so they are going to be producing more body temperature, more heat. The temperature of the body is going to go up. Okay, so that stimulus is the change in body temperature. That change in the internal environment is considered your stimulus. So again, higher body temperature, okay, will be picked up by the receptors. Now these receptors will take that high body temperature and compare it to the set point that is found in the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus will say, well, you know what? I need to lower my body temperature. My temperature now is way too high than it should be. Now, how do I do that? It will send different signals to different effectors. These effectors, for example, could be the sweat glands. Okay, so that individual will start sweating. It can also be to muscles. In this case, it would be the smooth muscles, which are the muscles that we have no control over. So the muscles of the of the blood vessels, the blood vessels are going to dilate. Dilate means to widen up. And that is going to lead to that flushing or redness that happens when we start exercising. That is due again to the dilation of the blood vessels. Blood is now closer to the surface of the body, closer to the skin, and you are able to evaporate. Excuse me, that excess body heat can radiate away from your body. So you'll see again that effectors can be more than one thing. So we had the smooth muscles of the blood vessels that led to vasodilation, and we also had sweat glands that increased the production of sweat. Now that response, it should bring your body temperature back to normal. And this is what this slide is showing you. So on this side right here, on this right-hand side, is telling you the whole story that we just talked about. What does the body do if the body temperature goes too high? Okay, and if it goes too low. So if it goes too high, like we said, the stimulus is change in body temperature picked up by the receptors. And because these receptors are picking up changes in body temperature, they are known as thermoreceptors. So thermo, kind of like a thermometer. And those are the thermoreceptors will send will send the signal to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to detect that change or compare it to the set point that was found in there. and realize that the temperature is too high, so it'll send some impulses to the effectors, in this case, your blood vessels in the skin, to dilate, and the sweat glands in order to produce more sweat. Okay, so what do you think would happen if the body temperature is too low? Okay, I would recommend that you kind of pause this video right now and think about it first before you listen to what I have to say. Okay, now that you've paused, okay, let's take the scenario, the opposite scenario. The body temperature is going down, so you're going outside, it's freezing cold out there, and the body is going through hypothermia, which is decrease in body temperature. Now, what is the name of the receptors that will detect that change? Again, these are also thermoreceptors. It will take that stimulus to the control center, which again is still the hypothalamus, compare it to a set point. Now, the hypothalamus will say that the body is too cold. I need to do something to warm up the body. So what do you think it would do? Well, it would send impulses to the smooth muscles in the skin. So we could get goosebumps. It'll also send impulses to your skeletal muscles where we would start shivering. These contractions will produce more heat. It'll also send impulses to the smooth muscles of the blood vessels in the skin in order to constrict. Okay, constrict means to become narrow. That will decrease the amount of blood reaching the skin. So people, when we're cold, we look pale because the blood is drawn away from the surface of the body to keep it on the inside and the internal organs, like to keep the kidneys, for example, warm, but keep that warmth away from the skin to decrease the amount of heat that radiates from our body to the outside. So hopefully you guys were able to kind of produce that scenario on your own. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to reach out anytime. Now, the example that we talked about, those are examples of negative feedback. That means that if something happens to the body, your body wants to reverse that change. So here you'll see that your body temperature went up. The body does everything it can to bring your body temperature back down to normal. That is known as negative feedback, where again, your body is trying to compensate for that change, to reverse the change. Positive feedback, though, on the other hand, is a little bit different. In positive feedback, your body is actually going to amplify the change. So when something changes, the body is going to make it worse. And it only does that for a good purpose. So we're kind of using this example of somebody trying to talk. And so that is a change in stimulus. Okay, sound is being produced. If nobody hears that person, then it's really useless. So they use a microphone to amplify the sound. Okay, and that again is what your body does. Sometimes in a change in body normal physiology, sometimes your body has to amplify that change in order to perform a function. Most of the homeostatic mechanisms are negative feedback. There are only a couple of examples that are positive feedback. When we go over an example, I'm pretty sure you will better understand this. So under normal circumstances, the uterus in females is not contracting. Okay, it is a relaxed uterus. But during delivery, the uterus starts to contract. Okay, which is a change. It's a deviation away from normal physiology. According to negative feedback, okay, your body would want to bring things back to normal, meaning to stop the contractions. Well, that will mean that that baby will never be delivered. So in order to deliver the baby, the body has to amplify those contractions. It'll amplify the change further away from normal physiology. Okay, so the uterus starts to contract. It'll contract even harder and harder, amplifying again and pretty much exaggerating the change in normal physiology until the baby is delivered. And then everything will go back to normal. So in positive feedback, again, you are going further away from normal until you reach your goal, which in this case is to deliver the baby, and then everything goes back to normal. So kind of going over these different feedbacks. Negative feedback, again, as I mentioned, is the most common kind, okay, where your effectors want to return your conditions back to your normal range. And it lessens the deviation away from your set point. So again, when your body temperature went up, your effectors, all of the changes that happen to your body, the sweating and so on, would want to bring things back to normal. And it's called negative because the response that happened is in the opposite direction of the change. So your body temperature went up, your response is to bring your body temperature back down. Okay, it prevents any sudden severe changes in body. So for example, the body temperature example that we've just, we've been talking about, blood pressure changes and changes in glucose levels in the body. Positive feedback is important, but it is not as common. Okay, the change or the deviation away from normal is actually intensified, and it keeps on increasing instead of decreasing. Okay, it is short-lived and it has a purpose. And once that purpose is accomplished, everything goes back to normal. Okay, it produces unstable conditions. So these uterine contractions are not normal. Okay, and it seems that you're going even further away from homeostasis. But again, until that baby is delivered, until the mission has been accomplished, and when that occurs, now that's when everything goes back to normal. So for example, uterine contractions, we talked about that already, and blood clotting. Okay, so blood clotting is another example. So we'll talk about it kind of really fast because in chapter 14, we'll talk about blood clotting in more detail. But in short, that when your blood starts clotting, and that again is a deviation away from the norm. So normally your blood does not clot, but when we are injured, in order to stop the bleeding, blood has to start clotting. But so now there's a blood clot that started. Instead of trying to go back to normal, which is not clotting, your body is going to amplify that change. The body is going to continue clotting as long as there is bleeding, until the body reaches the goal of the bleeding stopping. That's when blood clotting stops. Okay, so again, in both of these different examples, you deviate further away from normal. The change is intensified, okay, until you reach the goal. So in case of blood clotting, the bleeding has stopped. In case of uterine contractions, well, the baby was born. Okay, then things return back to normal. Now, how do we organize the human body? Okay, so we are going to, in anatomy, there are like all these different terms that we're going to be using, and we want to kind of familiarize ourselves with these different terms. So the human body is made mainly of this axial portion, so the axis, the head, neck, and trunk. And then we have these appendices, so the appendicular portion, the upper and the lower limbs. Okay, and then we have cavities. The axial portion is where you'll find these cavities. There's a cranial cavity in the head, and that's where the brain is. There is a spinal cavity or a vertebral canal, and that's where the spinal cord is. There's a thoracic cavity in the chest, and you'll find the lungs and the heart in that cavity. And then there is one big cavity known as the abdominopelvic cavity. It's made out of both the abdomen and the pelvis. There is a diaphragm, a muscle that separates the thoracic cavity above it from the abdominopelvic cavity below it. But there is nothing separating the abdomen from the pelvis. Okay, so this is basically one huge cavity, and sometimes we kind of blend them in together, as you see, and we call them the abdominopelvic cavity. So the diaphragm, again, that is a muscle that we use in order to breathe, and it separates the thorax above it, and underneath it you will find the abdominopelvic cavity. Okay, the mediastinum is part of the thoracic cavity, and it's found in between the lungs, and that's where the heart is. You'll also find the esophagus, the trachea, and the thymus gland. If you're not familiar with the thymus gland yet, that is totally fine. We'll talk about it, in more detail later on, but it is part of the immune system. Now, the abdominopelvic cavity, as we said, is mainly made out of the abdominal cavity, and that really extends from the diaphragm on top, okay, to the pelvic cavity. But again, there really is no distinct border between the abdomen and cavity. It's more of an imaginary line where above it would be the abdomen, and below that imaginary line would be the pelvis. Okay, you'll find in the abdominal cavity, you want to know the organs that are in there, or some of the important ones like the stomach, liver, spleen. Spleen is also part of the lymphatic system or the immune system, kidneys, small intestine, and the majority of the large intestine. Now, the pelvic cavity, again, that is more, it is inferior or below the abdominal cavity. It is found deep within the pelvic bones, and it has a part of the large intestine. It has you'll find the urinary bladder in there and the internal reproductive organs. So this is an image that will show you the major body cavities. We talked about the cranial cavity in the head that has the brain. We also have the vertebral canal that houses the spinal cord. Then you'll find the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity. Remember that separating the two, you will find the muscle of respiration known as the diaphragm. Above the diaphragm is the thoracic cavity. Below the diaphragm is the abdominopelvic cavity, and you can see here that imaginary line with the abdominal cavity above and the pelvic cavity below or inferior. Same thing goes for here as well. So again, that's your diaphragm. Superior or above it is the thoracic cavity. And the thoracic cavity is further divided into other cavities. So you'll find where the lungs are, those are known as the pleural cavity. Okay, this one here is the right side, and this is the left side. So notice that you are looking at the patient. Okay, so their right and left is going to be crisscross of your right and left. And then in the middle, that is the mediastinal cavity, where part of it is the pericardial cavity. Pericardial, peri means around, cardium means heart. So the pericardial cavity is the cavity that houses or that surrounds the heart. Now, underneath the diaphragm, we have the abdominopelvic cavity, and again, you could see that imaginary line separating the abdominal cavity above from the pelvic cavity below. So we've talked about basically, the cranial cavity that has the brain, but the head also has smaller cavities. Okay, a lot of these are known as the nasal sinuses. And the reason we have all of these different cavities in the skull is that so that the skull is not very heavy and it is more of a lighter bone. So the cavities that we have the oral cavity. Okay, we also have the nasal cavity, the orbital cavity, and that's where the eyes would be, and we have the cavity of the middle ear. For the sinuses, we have the frontal sinuses, the sphenoidal sinuses, ethmoidal, and maxillary. Those are not really here on this image, and you don't really have to worry about it for now, but we'll talk about them more in detail when we get to the bones of the body, when we talk about the skeletal system. Now these membranes that we talked about, okay, so the thoracic and the abdominopelvic membranes, they are lined by a layer, and that layer is known as, the serous membrane. So a membrane is basically a layer. You kind of want to think about it kind of like wallpaper, but it's double layered, so it has two layers, and it secretes a watery fluid. Watery fluid means a serous fluid. So serous is watery fluid, because we are going to be talking about later on, we'll talk about mucous membranes, and those membranes produce mucus, while these serous membranes produce water, or it's not really water, but is a very watery kind of fluid. Okay, so again, we talked about the double layered serous membranes. And the two layers, they have names. So there is a visceral layer, that is the inner layer, and that covers the organ, okay? That literally is right on top of the organ. While the parietal layer, that is the outer layer, and that will line the wall of the cavity. So I'm going to show you this image that I kind of took from another course to better explain how these two layers go. So if you imagine a balloon, okay, fill it up with a little bit of air, and then you put your fist in it as such, you are going to have these two different layers with a space in between. Okay, so this would be the visceral layer, the layer that is attached to the viscera, and viscera means organ. Okay, so this would become your visceral layer, or the inner layer, while the outer layer is known as the parietal layer. Okay, so if we take that, compare that to the layers of the heart. Okay, so your fist is now, we've put the heart instead of your fist in there. And the layer that surrounds the heart is known as the pericardium. So again, peri means surrounding, cardium means heart. So this would be the visceral pericardium. So the layer of the membrane that is in direct contact with the heart, while the outer layer is known as the parietal pericardium. Now the parietal pericardium would be lining the thoracic cage, meaning it would line the ribs. Okay. In between these two layers, there is that serous fluid. Remember, this is a serous membrane, so it'll make a very watery kind of fluid known as a serous fluid that fills that space known as the pericardial cavity. The amount of fluid that is made is very minimal. It is a very small amount of fluid. For the other layers, okay, so the one surrounding the heart, we already know it is known as the pericardium. The one that surrounds the lung, or the lungs, are known as the pleura. So there's the visceral and parietal pleura. And the serous membrane that surrounds the abdominal and pelvic organs is known as the peritoneum. Now we'll talk about the different systems. For each of these systems, for now, you want to know, obviously, the name of the system, the function, and the different parts of the system. This is something that, again, I would recommend putting on flashcards. We are definitely, as we go throughout the course, we're going to be going into the details of each of these systems. But very common questions right now are like the spleen, which system does it belong to, and so on. Okay, so the integumentary system. Integumentary is just a fancier term for skin and the outer structures. So that includes skin, hair, nails, everything related to the skin. So sweat glands, sebaceous glands, which are your oily glands, and so on. Okay, so the integumentary system, provides protection. It helps in temperature, in the regulation of body temperature, and we saw that when we were talking about homeostasis. It's important for sensory reception. So we feel pain, touch, pressure, all these different senses that we can feel is a function of the skin because we have different receptors. And it is also important for the production of vitamin D. Next would be your skeletal system, and that will be your bones. So it's made out of the different parts of the skeleton. It provides the kind of like a framework as to what the body is going to look like. It is important for muscle attachment. It is important because if we don't have bones, we wouldn't have joints. Okay, so joints provide that movement. Bones are also important for the protection of the inner organs. So, for example, the skull protects the brain. The thoracic cage protects the heart and the lungs. One important function of your skeletal system that you don't want to forget would be the production of blood cells. So inside bones, we have what is known as the red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is responsible for the production of blood cells. Now the next system to talk about is your muscular system. That's made out of the muscles that we can control. Those are known as your skeletal muscles. And there are other muscles that we cannot control. For example, the heart muscle, known as the cardiac muscle. And the muscles that move the organs on the inside, so the ones that move your small intestines or the urinary bladder. These are known as smooth muscle fibers. Well, your muscular system is obviously important for movement. It is the main source of body heat, and it helps in maintaining posture, and again, movement of joints and so on. Now, the nervous and endocrine system. So when we talk about it, we're definitely going to be talking about them as independent systems, but they are very much integrated, and in a lot of textbooks, you will find them known as the neuroendocrine system. The connection between them is the hypothalamus. So you will find that the hypothalamus is actually part of the nervous system and the endocrine system. Okay, but when we discuss them, to simplify things, we are going to talk about them individually. Okay, so the nervous system is made out of the brain and spinal cord and nerves. Okay, while the endocrine system is made out of a whole bunch of endocrine glands. For example, the thyroid gland, thymus gland, suprarenal, which would be on top of the kidneys. The pancreas is part of the endocrine system as well. We also have endocrine glands in the brain, and then the gonads, so the testes or the ovaries, depending on gender. And in both of these different systems, they are responsible for integration and coordination of different functions. They send out signals. These signals could be in the form of electricity in the case of nervous system, or the signals could be hormones in the case of the endocrine system. Now, the cardiovascular system, basically made out of the heart and the blood vessels. It also includes blood cells. It's responsible for the transportation of gases and nutrients. Okay, and it helps in getting rid of waste products as well. The lymphatic system is made out of the thymus gland and the spleen and all of these lymphatic vessels. Lymph is a kind of fluid that has its own lymphatic vessels, and it is considered part of the immune system. Okay, so it is responsible for body defense. And lymphocyte production. Lymphocyte is one of the 5 kinds of white blood vessels that we'll be talking about in chapter 14. Another system to keep in mind we'll be talking about is the digestive system. Okay, and when we talk about the digestive system, it's not about just digestion and absorption. It starts from the intake of food, okay, so mastication, which is chewing. We have to break down the food, digest and absorb, and then there's also excretion of waste. So you kind of want to keep that in mind when we talk about the digestive system. For the respiratory system, it's made out of different parts. So kind of going over the main organs, there are the lungs, the trachea, the larynx. All of these are parts of the respiratory system, and it is important for the exchange of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. The urinary system, made out of the kidneys, ureters, and the urinary bladder, and then the urethra. It'll remove different waste products from the blood and eliminate them through the urine. The amount of urine that we make and the concentration of urine is really important ways of how our body regulates electrolyte and water balance, and it's also useful in regulation of blood pressure. For the reproductive system, okay, so those are made out of the gonads and the production of gametes, which would be either the ovum or the sperm. And in addition, the female body is able to provide an area for fetal development and childbirth. So what are the lifespan changes? There's a lot of aging that occurs. It actually starts on a microscopic level before we're able to see it on an macroscopic level or by the naked eye. So hair starts to lose pigmentation and starts to become gray or white. The skin starts to lose some of the subcutaneous fat, which is the fat underneath the skin, and that will lead to skin wrinkling. We start to lose collagen and elastin, which are 2 different proteins found in our skin, and it helps the skin remain soft. So as we lose them as we age, the skin starts to stiffen. Okay, blood pressure starts to increase, and that can lead to hypertension or high blood pressure. The occurrence of diabetes or type 2, which is the adult onset kind, is also something to look out for as we age as well. Generally speaking, the tissues are going to become atrophic and the organs start to shrink, but that doesn't really affect the function of some organs. So you will see, for example, that the liver, for instance, that aging process doesn't really affect it much. Okay. Our cells, for most of our body cells, are able to undergo cell division, and they are able to undergo what is known as apoptosis, which is basically self-destruction as the cells become older. But as we as humans become older, even that process sometimes does not work correctly. Okay. Our metabolism decreases, and that is the reason for the increase in body weight as we age, and hence the need for exercise and diet adjustment in order to also prevent not just increase in body weight, but also to prevent the occurrence of type 2 diabetes and hypertension. The enzymes, they start where, as we age, we make less enzymes, and then the enzymes even tend to slow down. Sometimes some individuals will develop dementia or Alzheimer's disease. Now for the anatomical terminology. Again, we're going to be using a lot of anatomical terms as we go through the course, and not just in this course, but in other courses. And as you read different textbooks, there has to be a way where we all have the same image in our head. So for example, if I want to say that under normal circumstances, my hand is always underneath or below my head. Okay, well, what if I'm raising my hand? Okay, so my hand is now above my head, but that is not the anatomical position. So a standardized position is known as the anatomical position, where the human is standing erect, so we're standing up, facing forward. The upper limbs are to the side, as you see here, okay, with the palms facing forward, okay, and the fingers are kind of fanned apart from each other. Okay, so all of the anatomical terms that we're going to be talking about are based on this anatomical position. Okay, so always, the hand is always going to be inferior or below to the head. Okay, no matter what is going on with this human, the correct anatomical position is always going to be the hand is inferior to the head. So these are the different terms. Okay, so we do have images for them. Okay, so superior is above and inferior is below. Okay. Towards the front, there are two terms for those, and that could be either anterior or ventral. While towards the back, it could either be posterior or dorsal. Now, further away or towards the midline, medial and lateral. So I'm going to show you an image. So this right here is the midline of this young lady. Closer to the midline is medial. Further away from the midline is lateral. So if you look at point A and point B, point A is medial, point B is further away from the midline, and that is known as a lateral point. Okay, so medial and lateral would be according to their position to the midline. So the closer you are to the midline, that would be medial. Further away from the midline is lateral. Now, proximal and distal would be your closeness or proximity to the trunk. So the closer you are to the trunk is proximal. Further away from the trunk is distal. So I'll give you an example. If you compare the hip joint to the knee joint, think for a minute, which one is proximal and which one is distal? If you said that the hip joint is proximal and the knee joint is distal, you are correct. Okay, so proximal is closer to the trunk, while distal is more distant away, is further away from the trunk. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, superficial and deep. So superficial is closer to the body surface, while deep is internal, okay, is deeper. So if you compare, say, your skin to the liver, which one is superficial and which one is deep? Obviously, the skin is going to be superficial and the liver is a deep organ. Now, a couple of other terms to keep in mind would be bilateral. That would be on both sides. So if we say that a person had a stroke with a bilateral paralysis, meaning that paralysis was on both sides. Now you want to compare or contrast that with ipsilateral and contralateral. Ipsilateral means on the same side. So for instance, if you hear that somebody had a stroke on the right side of the brain, with ipsilateral paralysis. So where would the paralysis be? Would it be on the right side or on the left side? Remember, the stroke was on the right. So ipsilateral means that it's on the same side, so it would be on the right. While contralateral will be the opposite side. So if somebody has a stroke on the right side of the brain, the paralysis is contralateral, will be on the left side. And that's usually what happens. So when stroke happens on one side, the paralysis is usually on the opposite side. Okay, so ipsilateral is on the same side, contralateral is on the opposite side. Bilateral would be on both sides. Now for the different sections or planes, and we really use these when we are looking at, so for example, at x-rays or CTs or MRI scans, we want to be able to divide the body into different sections. So there is a sagittal section, and that sagittal section is it is a longitudinal cut that divides the body into a left and right portion. Okay. So I'm going to actually go to the pictures because I think it helps better understand that. So that blue section that you see, that blue plane that you see, that is known as the median or the mid-sagittal plane. That is right in the middle, and it goes all the way from the top of the head all the way down to the bottom. And it's mid-sagittal because it divides the body into an equal right and left side. While that pink plane that you see, that is known as the parasagittal. Para means neighboring or beside. So it is the one that is beside the sagittal plane. And it'll still divide the body into a right and left portions, but they are not equal. So you'll see your mid-sagittal plane divides the body into equal left and right sides, while the parasagittal plane divides the body into unequal left and right sides. We also have this plane right here, and that is known as the frontal or coronal plane. It kind of looks like a crown, okay? And that divides the body into an anterior part and a posterior part, so a front and a back. So the plane that divides the body into front and back, or anterior and posterior portions, that is known as your frontal or coronal plane. The last but not least of these planes, that's the orange one, and that is known as the transverse or horizontal plane, and that divides the body into a superior and inferior portion, so an upper and lower part. You want to be familiar with all of these terms. If it has two different names, you need to know them both. Here are different sections of the brain. So this right here is your mid-sagittal section, dividing the brain into equal right and left. This here is a transverse section of the brain, dividing the brain into a superior and inferior portion. While this is a frontal or a coronal section, frontal or coronal plane, and that divides the body into the brain into an anterior and posterior parts. So what about cylindrical organs like blood vessels, for example? So there are different ways of different sections for them. So there's a cross section. In a cross section, you will get a circle. An oblique section, though, on the other hand, where the section is kind of like on an angle, you will get an oval shape. A longitudinal section, you will kind of get this cylindrical looking structure. So these sections, you can use those in blood vessels, ureter, which is the organ that takes the urine from the kidneys to the bladder. It can also be used for the trachea or the intestine. So anything that looks like a cylinder, we could use these body sections in order to visualize them when needed. Now, how do we divide kind of like the abdominopelvic area? We either have quadrants. So quadrants means one of four. Those are known as the abdominal quadrants, or the regions, abdominal regions, and those are 9. So I'm going to talk first about the abdominal quadrants. So in order to do that, we need to know these 2 lines. So the line goes from the tip of the sternum. That bone is known as the sternum. The very tip all the way through the midline, through the belly button or the umbilical or the umbilicus, all the way down to the pubic bone, to the middle of the pubic bone. So through basically the midline of the body, and then through the flanks for the horizontal section. That will divide the abdomen into these 4 quadrants. Remember that you are looking at the patient, and the patient's right and left are crisscross from yours. So this is the right upper quadrant, and this is the left upper quadrant. Down here would be the right lower quadrant, and this is the left lower quadrant. So why do we have to know these quadrants? Well, a patient comes in and they say they have abdominal pain. Okay, well, they're not going to tell you abdominal pain, but they'll say that there's pain, say, in my stomach. Okay, well, can you tell me exactly where it is? And they will tell you, well, they'll, point to this area. So you would write down that there is pain in the right upper quadrant area. And that means that you kind of narrowed down a little bit where the pain might be coming from. So it could be coming from that liver, could be coming from the green gallbladder. Okay, so we use these quadrants to kind of pinpoint, make it easier for us to figure out what might be going on with these patients. But these quadrants are too big. And if the lesion is in the midline, for example, in the urinary bladder, so what are we supposed to put this under? Are we supposed to put this under right lower quadrant or left lower quadrant? So we now have these abdominal regions to kind of take care of that problem. Okay, so we have these 9 regions. I'll talk actually about the regions in the middle first. So there's the epigastric region. The epigastric region means the region on top of the stomach. That orange organ right here is the stomach. And then there's the umbilical region that surrounds the umbilical area. And there is the pubic region down here, and you can see here the urinary bladder. So if somebody has pain down here, you could say, well, the patient is experiencing pain in the pubic region. Now for the regions on the side, those are identical bilaterally. So on both sides, they have the same names. So there is the right and left hypochondriac region. Chondriac is related to the ribs. So hypochondriac means underneath the ribs. So your right and left hypochondriac regions. And then these are the lateral regions. So right and left lateral regions. These are found on either side. So they're like on the flanks, on the sides of the umbilical region. And then on the 2 sides of the pubic region, we have the right and left inguinal region. This concludes chapter 1. Please let me know if you have any questions.